You're listening to the 412 podcast from FBC Mustang in Mustang, Oklahoma, where we take you behind the scenes as we equip the saints for the work of the ministry. I'm Jeremy Davis, your host. Let's get started. What is it that you're looking forward to the most?
Great chance to get to know people better.
It is an absolute madhouse.
I try to find a place with good salads.
So 3 sermons a day.
I never did youth ministry, mainly because I'm scared.
It feels good up here.
We run to the woods thinking, Lord, take my life. I'm done.
Often how I prepare my own heart. I'm looking and reading and thinking.
We had students in the room, 6th through 12th graders, singing at the top of their lungs the doxology.
The engine that is pulling the train should be truth.
I like it.
I like it too.
Okay.
And welcome back to the pod, Mr. Snodgrass. We're going to continue to talk about Genesis 1 through 11. How's it going today?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. You ready to jump back in and keep going?
I think so.
Very good. Before we get going on this, we're going to jump in at Genesis 4. Before we do, I'd like to just mention May 24th, we have our Crossroads Conference coming up. $30 per person. You can go to fbcmustang.org/crossroadscon to find out more and to register. But we've got an exciting special guest coming to be a part of that. It's a conference for 17 to 25-year-olds, anyone that age group. So if you're late high school up into a newlywed or just young adult, register, come, be a part of it. You don't have to be a member of our church or anything like that. But we have Dr. Jeff Chang from the Spurgeon Library at Midwestern coming. And our theme is Spurgeon for today. So we're going to be looking back at a little bit of church history and seeing what we can learn from the Prince of Preachers himself, and get to know him a little bit more. We'll have 2 main sessions. We'll have a pre-conference going on for anyone interested in further ministry or theological education. We're going to have a ministry luncheon that's going on. We'll have breakout sessions, giveaways, all kinds of fun stuff. So go there, check it out, come be a part. And Joey, you'll be doing a breakout session there.
Yes, I will.
Very good. So if nothing else, come listen to Joey.
Yeah, don't come just for me. You'll be sorely disappointed.
No, it'll be well worth it, as always. So let's jump in. We ended 2 weeks ago with Genesis 3:15 and just talking about that being the precursor to and the first mention of Christ. Let's see here in chapter 4. Sin certainly does not slow down since the fall of man. In verse 3, if anything, it just continues and gets worse. We see a slippery slope here, and people quickly get into worse sin. So, tell us a little bit about chapter 4 here.
Yeah, so Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden after their sin in chapter 3. Adam names his wife Eve, which means the mother of all living. So he still trusted God's promise even after their rebellion and sin. And so they start having kids outside the garden or east of Eden, and it quickly goes downhill. We don't know how long they were in the garden. We also don't know how old Cain and Abel were when this skirmish took place, but we assume that some time has passed because these boys appear to be grown men.
Yeah.
And so they both offer offerings. They both bring offerings to the Lord. So Cain was a worker of the ground, so he's a farmer. Abel was a keeper of sheep, or a shepherd, as we'd call him. And they both brought offerings. We don't know exactly if the Lord commanded them to bring offerings or why they thought this was a good idea. Presumably the Lord told them to worship him in this way. So Abel brings the first of his flock, the best of his flock, and offers a blood sacrifice. Cain just brings some of his vegetables, some of the produce of the ground. And the Lord regarded the offering of Abel. Verse 5 says, "But for Cain and his offering he had no regard." So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And so Cain did not please the Lord with his sacrifice, whether his heart wasn't in the right place or the thing that he sacrificed wasn't pleasing to the Lord. We're not exactly clear on, but it is clear that the Lord was displeased, and Cain knew it. And so he was angry. And what is he going to do out of his anger? He should have repented, should have returned to the Lord, but instead he decides to kill his brother out of jealousy.
Yeah.
So we have what's called fratricide here, a murder of a brother. And when Jesus in John 8 says that Satan, or the devil, was a murderer from the beginning, I think he's got this story in mind of Cain killing Abel.
Yeah. And often kind of referred to as the thought of evil. Using that name, Cain, as now he kind of represents that. Probably a reason you don't meet a lot of Cains running around. So
Yeah.
maybe we should make us weary of raising Cains.
Maybe.
Different spelling though.
Their chicken is devilishly good.
Yeah, something like that. That's good. Okay, so then in chapter 5, we get into Adam's descendants all the way to Noah. And tell us, why is this important? Why does this matter? And maybe something unique going on here.
Yeah, so chapter 5 is another structural marker. So this would be the second Toledot. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. So this is kind of the next point, so to speak, that Moses is hanging this narrative on.
Yep.
And what he gives us here is a genealogy from Adam to Noah. And in the narrative, this is kind of functioning like a fast-forward button almost. It doesn't mean the details that he does list here are unimportant, but he's almost fast-forwarding us to the next point that he wants to zoom in on, which would be Noah. And so there's some super long ages listed here, like Adam lives 930 years, which isn't even the longest or the second longest of lifespan that's mentioned here in Genesis 5.
Right.
But as you read through these, this is before the flood comes, which brought catastrophic destruction to the earth. And so we'd expect that it was a lot easier to live longer.
Yeah.
Life on this planet was less harsh back then.
Yep.
And really, there's no gaps here. He doesn't mention every single person that ever lived through this time, but he is tracing his family line from from Adam through Noah.
Yeah.
And so my persuasion, my conviction is that this is an unbroken line. And so I think we have a fairly accurate timestamp on how much time passed from the flood back to creation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's interesting when you look at a timeline, Adam would have met Noah's grandfather Methuselah, certainly, maybe even Noah's father.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty close in there. But he dies about the time Noah's father is born. So you're not talking about, when you think about like oral tradition and history of these stories being passed down, we're not talking about 15 generations. That
Of the telephone game.
right, exactly. This is maybe 2 or 3 generations at most.
Yeah.
So it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and so Adam, living 930 years, he's able to tell the story of his wife being created.
Yep.
For until Noah was around, essentially.
Yeah.
This story would have been preserved. We don't know exactly how Moses got access to this information. Maybe Noah took a lot of documents with him on the ark.
Yeah.
And then obviously the Lord is free and knows everything to reveal to Moses. But
Right.
it's a fascinating piece of history. We don't know a ton about this era of history just in general, even outside the Bible.
Yeah. And even Noah, living as long as he did, he probably didn't meet Abraham, but at least Abraham's dad. I mean, they come really close in age as well, which is that's, again, just unbelievable to think about. Especially when you think about passing down all these stories, just orally, and passing down the history of these people.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we get into a really kind of crazy chapter, and that's chapter 6, and this has been a chapter that's kind of been a point of conversation between us, and I know a lot of people that have come in my home recently have heard me talk a little bit about this, and it's kind of spurred on some conversations about documentaries that are out there and different stuff. So let's walk through chapter 6. Tell us a little bit about what's going on here.
Yes, I'll just read the first 4 verses. Again, pretty wild, a lot of conflicting opinions and beliefs about these verses. So I'll just read verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then Yahweh said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, really kind of interesting 4 verses here. There are multiple different interpretations of this. So, first question we need to ask is, who were the daughters of man? So some people would say, this is the line of this is outside the line of Seth. So who are the sons of God? The sons of God would be the line of Seth, because he was the godly seed of Adam. Mm-hmm. And then the daughters of man would be those outside that line that they intermarried with. I don't think that's a good explanation for a couple of reasons. Number one is it just says when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. It's unspecified who they came from, whether it was Seth or someone else. And then the sons of God in the Old Testament is almost exclusively a reference to angelic beings.
Yep.
And so we get in the book of Job, the sons of God were gathered in council around Yahweh's throne, and Satan is included in that mix. And so these are angelic beings, either fallen or unfallen, so angels or demons. And so I take it that the sons of God here are angelic beings, and the Nephilim, that word literally means to fall in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's intentionally describing those who fell from heaven.
Yeah.
And so the daughters of man are just human women, in my opinion. The sons of God would be angelic beings who see these women and view them as attractive, and they take them as their wives. And so I take this as these demons were cohabiting with these human women. And the mechanics of how that works, angels are spiritual beings, and so we don't know exactly how this would have worked, but it seems that Moses is describing here that the offspring they produced were giants, or the Nephilim as they're called.
Yeah.
And so it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. That means in the 120 years leading up to the flood, and also afterward, I take to mean after those 120 years, so after the flood as well.
Yep.
And it says when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, they bore children to them. So some questions of like, some people would view, okay, so these are demons who probably possessed men, and then they got these women pregnant. That's possible, because that view would say, well, angels they don't have bodily forms, and so that they couldn't do this.
Yeah.
We also see later in Genesis that angels do take on bodily form. In Genesis 18, people appear outside of Abraham's tent, and he shows hospitality to them. We learn later that those are angels, and those angels go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah think that they're just common men.
Yeah.
You think of other things like Hebrews 13:2, don't neglect to show hospitality, for by so doing some have entertained angels unawares. And so the author of Hebrews seems to be saying, show hospitality to strangers, because some people have entertained angels by showing hospitality to people.
Yeah.
And you think of that Genesis 18 account of Abraham showing hospitality to these men
Right.
who turned out to be angels.
Yeah.
So I know that's kind of a hot take, and some people will disagree with me, and that's fine. I think that's the best interpretation of the text.
Yeah, and I would wholeheartly agree with that interpretation of it, and I think you're right on, and I think there's some other clues throughout, and even things like in Numbers 13, it refers to the Nephilim and making the Israelites look like grasshoppers. They're so big, and so things like that. I think there are other small clues that point to it. But I think you're right, and it sounds strange, it sounds bizarre.
Oh yeah,
and it's certainly not something that we can understand exactly, and we may not this side of eternity. But I do think it's a good reminder that this book is not a science book. This isn't a science textbook trying to explain every minute detail of exactly how everything came into being. This is a story about God and what he has done and what he brought forth and the way he has dealt with man and how he redeems man. And even when things are as backwards as they get. And what you see is the destruction of what human sexuality is supposed to look like and what relationships are supposed to look like. And that's the world we live in today. I mean, we are mutilating people and children because we have completely destroyed the idea, trying to reject the idea of what it looks like to be created in the image of God with a reason and with a purpose. And that's what's incredible about especially these first 11 chapters, and really all the Bible is incredible because it all points to who Christ is and who we are in light of him. But these first 11 chapters just lay down the groundwork so well for who we are and that we do have purpose and reason for being and living. And one thing that I remind our Crossroads students of is that, if you ever struggle with self-doubt and struggling with what is your purpose and why are you here, and you struggle in light of what maybe school's teaching you or what culture's trying to teach you, remember that you have a God who's created you intentionally, and if he can be so precise with the sophisticated world that he's created, and then even when the world's rejecting him, he can go in and correct it and bring correction to it and show mercy and goodness. certainly he will do that in your life. Certainly he's done that for you, that he has created you with intent and with purpose in a very sophisticated manner. And what a great reminder that although creation has just gone awry here, the Lord does bring restoration. And it's a great promise that when we know that the Lord had did this here, and when he says he's coming again, and that one day we'll live in perfection, in glory forever, we can trust that promise.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay, so then the flood comes. We're given 120 years, so a section in the ESV starting in verse 9, Noah and the flood. So let's continue this narrative.
Yeah, so the flood is what God brings because of the corruption on the earth, including the fallen angels, the havoc they're wreaking in verses 1 through 4, but also 5 through 8, the havoc that man is bringing and the chaos he's bringing through his sin. It says every thought of his heart was only evil continually. And so the Lord says, I'm going to completely blot out every living creature except what's with Noah and on the ark. So Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, along with Noah's wife, so 8 people in all, are saved on the ark according to God's plan and God's promise, along with the creatures that the Lord brings to Noah to be on the ark with him.
Yeah.
So the flood comes, it rains 40 days and 40 nights unceasingly, and it says that even the highest mountain was covered, I think it's 15 cubits deep, so that'd be about 22 feet deep in water over the highest elevation that existed on earth at the time. So nothing would have been able to survive this flood. And so he's in the ark for about a year while he's waiting for the waters to subside and to go away. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and he slowly has to wait for the bathtub to drain, so to speak, for all this water to go back into its place so he can get out and the earth will be habitable.
Yeah, that's good. And I think one thing to point out is that a lot of times we look at Noah as like he's this, higher than everybody else, kind of righteous person. But verse 5 says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great, that every intention and the thoughts, his heart was only evil. It was evil continually. And it's not until the Lord announces what he's going to do, that he's going to blot out man, he decides to give favor to Noah in verse 8. And it's after that he's noted as righteous and chosen to be the one that's going to go through this. He's elected, called out. He's that remnant of mankind that he's going to preserve and take through. And then when you get into chapter 8, verse 1 says, but God remembered Noah. And we see that the Lord is not going to forget his that he's called to himself. He's going to keep them. He's going to sustain them and see them through the hardship that he's called him to. I think a lot of times we look at Christianity and think, hey, if I'm Christian, if I do all of this, the Lord will bless me. I won't have to deal with hard things in life anymore. But really, the promise of Christianity and the promise of Christ is that he'll sustain us through the hardship, not that he's going to take the hardship away. Even Christ walked through temptation and hardship and all of that. He did it all perfectly, and he did it all without falling, and we mess up all the time. But the promise, the great promise of the Lord is that he's going to walk us through the hardship that we face. He's going to preserve us and keep us.
Yeah, and certainly keep us from his wrath. So Noah certainly faced hardships and trials through this. I went crazy being cooped up in my house during 2020 for a while with a few people. Like, he was in a boat for a year with all these animals. Like, I'm sure the smell was horrible, but
and his in-laws.
Jeremy said that. And so Noah would have encountered various trials while he's in the ark, but they're kept from God's wrath, which was the flood.
Yeah.
And so God always preserves his people from his wrath.
That's exactly right.
We see that ultimately in the cross of Christ. We as God's people are preserved from God's wrath because of what his son has done. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean we won't have suffering or trials in this life. We will have lots of them,
right?
Especially as Christians, but we will always be preserved from his wrath.
Yeah, amen. That's good. That's really good. Okay, keep us going here in Genesis 8.
Yeah, so the flood subsides fully in chapter 8, and everything comes out of the ark, and the Lord blesses them, kind of going into chapter 9 now, but he blesses them, calls them again to be fruitful and multiply, similar to what he told Adam and Eve at the end of Genesis chapter 1.
Yep.
But he makes a covenant with Noah and says, I will never again, this is verse 21 of chapter 8, curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And so he makes a covenant that never again will he blot out every living creature with water, which is an important distinction because he will destroy the universe through fire, like 2 Peter says. But God's people will all be preserved through that. And so never again will he destroy the earth in this catastrophic manner again through water.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 9, he gives a sign for this covenant, which is something the Lord graciously does for our faith. Is when he makes a covenant, he always gives signs of the covenant.
Yep.
And so the sign of this covenant is the rainbow. So he says, I put my bow in the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
And really what he's saying is so that you remember that I remember the promise I made to you.
Yeah.
So he says,
Yeah.
when you see my bow in the clouds, you'll remember that I remember the promise I made to you.
Yeah.
And so the rainbow is the sign of this covenant of God's mercy and grace. It doesn't mean we sin less now.
Right.
It just means that God is not going to judge us catastrophically in the way that he did in the flood.
Yeah.
And so you think about the signs that he's made through for the covenants. The covenant he made with Abraham, the sign was circumcision.
Yep.
Fast forwarding all the way to the new covenant, the signs are baptism and the Lord's Supper.
Yep.
And so these are intended to help our faith
Yep.
and to help us remember that God remembers the promises he's made to us through Christ.
Yeah. That's so good. That's so good.
And these are also not only aid our faith, but they also provoke questions from our kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't tell you how many times we see a rainbow and my kids will be like, why? Why is it there?
Yep.
That's a question my son loves to ask. He's in the
Yeah.
phase of why. And so it's a great opportunity to explain, well, why is there a rainbow?
Right.
And I remember Amelia, it was a couple years ago now, but we were sitting in a Sunday evening service Sunday morning service, and someone was getting baptized, and she just said, why is she getting baptized?
Yep.
And we said, because she believes in Jesus. And she's like, I want to get baptized. We're like, well, you have to believe in Jesus. And she's like, I want to believe in Jesus. And so anyway, it's just this brief little conversation during service,
Right.
provoked by the sign of the covenant,
Yep.
of the new covenant. So
Yeah, and that's one thing I always tell people if they're struggling with being baptized, because and it's like the public, like I don't want to have to, they have stage fright. They don't want to get up in front of people or whatever. And I always try to remind them, like, this is the public proclamation of who you are in Christ. And if you're being baptized, soon after you've been saved, this is likely the first opportunity you have to publicly share the gospel with people and to proclaim what Christ has done in your life. And what a great reminder.
Yeah.
And we have similar stories with our kids, with the Lord's Supper. And what a strange thing for, you're sitting there as a 5-year-old and, coloring in your notebook or whatever. And all of a sudden they start passing out snacks and you're like, wait a second, I want a cracker and some juice. Like, what's going on here? And it's the perfect opportunity for us to share the gospel with our kids right there. And it's so often I'm moved to tears during Lord's Supper because, like, right now our 5-year-old, she'll soon be 6, our daughter Calvin, she is sitting in the services with us. And every time we take Lord's Supper, it's this just beautiful little conversation happening between my wife Chelsea and her, and just Chelsea just sharing the gospel with her right there in the middle of the church service, sharing with her what these elements mean and the reason for them, and she's beginning to really start to understand what the gospel is, and starting to come up with some conclusions on her own, and it's a really cool thing to see. Okay, so let's go to. So we see in the back half of chapter 9, we see Noah's descendants. So take us from there into 10, and let's start heading towards chapter 11.
Yeah, so the end of chapter 9 is a little bit of a dark chapter. So we see that Noah is not perfect. He is righteous by faith, as you had mentioned, and it would take faith to be obedient because the Lord just told him there'd be a flood.
Right.
And you're like, what? And so he constructs this ark because of the faith he had in God's promise.
Yep.
But he still was not a perfect man. So he comes off the ark with his sons and their wives. And verse 20 of chapter 9 says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And so some people would say Noah was just like, he was not fully adapted to life after the flood. He wasn't used to grape juice fermenting, and so he wasn't expecting this. I don't think there's any indication in the text that that's the case. I think this is sin on his part. I don't think it's a result of his ignorance.
Right.
He was a very intelligent man. He built the ark.
Yeah.
And so he became sinfully drunk here and lay naked in his tent. Because of this, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Verse 20, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." So we don't know a lot of details about what happened here, but there are some similar kind of narratival indications that Moses is giving us that connect us to a story before this and also a story after this. It shares a lot of vocabulary with the Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 story of Adam and Eve being naked in the garden and unashamed, but then also recognizing their nakedness and needing a covering after they sinned with the fruit of the tree.
Right.
So similarities there with Noah. Fast forwarding to Lot, he became drunk as well, sinned with his daughters. And so, again, fruit of the vine, fruit of the tree, nakedness, kind of connecting these three narratives of sin in the book of Genesis. So dark times, he hands out a curse to Canaan and then blessing to Shem and Japheth. And we actually see those being prophetic throughout the rest of the book. But then Noah dies here at 950 years old after he lived a long life.
Long life.
Then we get to chapter 10, which has been called the Table of Nations. And here there are 70 names, and these names represent individual people, but they were significant people, and the Lord caused their tribes to increase. And so really the names of these people are the names of nations. So things like Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan, throughout this book or throughout this chapter. So we get a table of nations, which is really a genealogy of everyone else that was existing at this time.
Yeah.
And it's not a comprehensive list of everyone that existed, but I don't think it's kind of skipping around and skipping hundreds of years of history. I think this is a contiguous family line and descent here.
Yeah.
And that brings us to chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. And it's a fascinating account for a number of reasons. This is where God confused their languages. But these people, God had told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which would imply kind of some spreading out that would need to take place. And these people said, nah, we're gonna stay right here in the land of Shinar, which becomes Babylon later, and we're going to make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
We want people to remember we were here. This was our land. This is where we dwell. So we're going to build a tower to the heavens, and likely would have been using it to worship false gods or themselves, and just trying to make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
And ironically, they built this tall tower that reaches to the heavens, but the Lord has to go down to even see it. So it's kind of funny how Moses describes this. So the Lord came down to see the city, this is verse 5, and the tower which the children of man had built. And Yahweh said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So Yahweh dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth. And Babel just means confusion. And from there Yahweh dispersed them over the face of all the earth. And so the Lord accomplishes his purposes and his intent through confusing their language. And when things like this happen in the Bible, my question is, like, how quickly did it happen? So you think about the ascension of Jesus, like, how fast did he ascend? Was it awkwardly slow, or was it mediumly paced?
Right.
And here it's like, how long did it take to confuse their language? Like, were they mid-sentence and then just started completely misunderstanding each other?
Yeah.
Was this over a period of days or weeks? We don't know that,
Right.
but we do know the Lord confused their language.
Yeah.
And history actually corroborates this, because there's no, like, evolution of languages.
Yeah.
So you would think that there would just be a nice language tree that would all go back to one language, and there's not.
Right.
There are lots of languages that just leap into existence without relationship to prior languages.
Right.
So Sumerian is one of these languages. It's not connected to any other ancient language. It just exists, and then it dies out, and no one ever speaks it again. So there's no carryover with that language, and it's because Genesis 11 is true.
Yep.
The Lord caused these languages to exist all of a sudden.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to why you just have these very similar, origin stories, origin myths that are spread all over our planet, that all have something to do with a catastrophic flood, a small group of people that survive it, and then these fears of serpents and things falling from the sky and all this. I mean, there's all of these like same stories that are all over the place, and they seem to be people groups that are completely unrelated to one another, and they all seem like they kind of go back to the same period of time. And it's because, like you said, Genesis 11 is true.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and some of the details of those origin stories will be different. You know, some people have 6 people surviving the flood. Some people have 12. And so we believe the biblical account is true that there were 8.
Absolutely.
And Peter confirms that. He says 8 souls in all in 1 Peter. And so we think there's just 8. But even though some of those details are wrong in those other origin stories, I don't think the idea itself is wrong. They still have a small group of people surviving the flood.
Yep.
So they don't have all the details correct, but they do have still this same story.
Yeah, and even going back to Genesis 6, in a lot of those stories, you have references to giants and different beings from the sky and all kinds of different stuff that's going on that does kind of go hand in hand with what we're reading here, and it does give a lot of validity. Not that it needs validity from other historical places, but it does kind of point back to everyone did kind of come from the same place.
Yeah. Yeah, and then this Babel kind of gets undone at some point in the New Testament in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit falls on the disciples and they start speaking languages that they didn't know previously, and they're telling the mighty works of God in foreign languages.
Yeah.
And so there, for that moment, the Lord sort of undoes what the consequence was here at Babel, and people can understand, not so they can rebel against God, but they can hear in their own language what God has done through Christ.
Yeah.
And I think it's a portrait of what heaven will be like. There will be no language barrier in heaven.
Right.
I don't know what we'll speak in heaven. Probably not English, but whatever we speak, we'll be able to understand each other.
Yeah.
And it'll be a glorious time.
Yeah, it sure will. Man, Joey, this has been good to go through these first 11 chapters. Maybe we'll work our way through the rest of Genesis at some point in the future, but that's for another time. Joey, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for all your insight as we walk through this book together.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thank you, listener, for joining us once again for the 412 podcast. If you'd like to find out more about FBC Mustang, you can go to fbcmustang.org. Check out our events. Check out all of our details for different services and different things that are going on. And until next time, thanks, listener. We'll see you here on the 412 podcast. This podcast is made possible by the members of First Baptist Mustang. This podcast is produced by John Osmus, our Director of Media, artwork by Olivia Travis, Director of Communications, and music by Pastor John Brewer, Worship Pastor here at FBC Mustang. For more information about First Baptist Church in Mustang, you can go to fbcmustang.org. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the 412 podcast.